Hello and welcome to another Fantasy Premier League video. My name is Steve and today we're taking a little bit of a look at a captaincy dilemma that has popped up in my team. Well, sort of popped up in my team, but we'll go into that in a little bit. I managed to score 88 points in game week 1 with a game week rank of 100k. So a very good start to the season. Happy days. I was up at 5 AM New Zealand time for the deadline at the beginning of the game week, and I was listening to Andy's deadline stream, and I did hear that Gabriel sounded like he might be out for the game week, but given the fixture was about 24 hours away from when Andy released that news, and that Andy didn't sound too confident that the information was in fact correct, even though he did switch his player to another Arsenal defender. And the fact that my eyes were literally hanging out of my head at 5 AM, I decided not to do anything rash and to just stick with Gabriel instead of switching to Saliba. So that kind of cost me 4 points on the whole, but apart from that, the team has done pretty damn well. The main differentials that came through for me was Mbeumo, who sunk his penalty, which is basically the reason we've got him in the team. He also missed an absolute sitter. Madison came through with 2 assists and 3 bonus points. Had an amazing game, was just involved in everything. Super happy to have him in the squad. And to a lesser extent, João Pedro and Chilwell. João Pedro, when I put him in the team a couple of weeks ago, was about 5 or 6% owned when I had him in. He's now up around 20-odd%, but he also scored a penalty. Chilwell also had a goal denied, but his ownership's up around, 16%, so still a bit of a differential. Salah came through with the assist and also had a goal denied, and that was pretty much how the game week rounded out. So I'll go through my team in a little bit more detail in the team selection video later in the week, but this video is just going to focus on the captaincy around Salah. Now, if you are new to the channel, it's my second season doing FPL content. I have created a league for viewers to follow along. If you would like to do so, there'll be a link in the description below. But apart from that, let's jump into it. So the question on a lot of managers' minds out there is, would you captain Salah if you in fact have him in your team? Now, Salah is currently owned by 28.7% of the game, so that's pretty decent. That's like, more than a quarter, less than a third. So there are quite a lot of managers out there with Salah sitting in their squads. I suspect most of them are in a 2 premium setup. I doubt many people would have gone Salah over Haaland, so we'd probably assume that a lot of that 28% is teams running a 2 premium setup. So the first thing that we'll go over is the second premium captaincy narrative that seems to be floating around in the community, and I thought I'd just detail that because it seems to be popping up all over the place. And it sounds like most managers, most content creators are questioning why you would have a second premium if you weren't going to captain them. And I think that most of the content creators have arrived at the decision that it's actually not worthwhile doing that, as there's too much money invested in just one player, and that the best strategy overall is to in fact spread the funds across your team, either throughout your starting 11 or into upgrading one bench spot. I don't see too many content creators with 2 strong bench spots. It's usually just bench spot number 1 that have had the additional funds sunk into. So If this is the first video you're seeing on my channel and you haven't been following along pre-season, I will update you as to Salah being a very late addition to my squad. My plan was to start with Kane for the start of the 23-24 season. And if we actually go and have a quick look at the fixtures for Kane, Spurs and Man City. So obviously Spurs play Manchester United at home this week. This is if I would have still had Kane in my squad, which I would have had he not been sold to Bayern. So I actually had no plans at all to captain Kane this game week. I was still going to be running with the Haaland captaincy. And in fact, if you have a look at the set of fixtures on screen, I actually had no plan to captain Kane at all. I wanted the second premium in my squad without captaincy, but now that Kane has obviously been sold to Bayern, I did do the switch, moved those funds from up front and straight into Salah in midfield. I was starting with 3-4-3. I just switched it over to a 3-5-2 and rotated around the 4.5 midfielder for a striker, or vice versa, in order to fit that in. So my whole strategy didn't actually revolve around having Kane or my second premium as captain at all. So in order to explain what my strategy was, I should probably briefly go over what the solo Haaland strategy is, which is just to perma captain Kane, and that you don't need another premium in your team because you're not going to be captaining them. Spread the funds around, invest in the bench, etc., etc. Now the way I was looking at it was I was going to be permanently captaining Haaland as well and just having Kane in the squad. Now, there's a few reasons for that. First of all, Haaland, well, before the season started, was up around 80% ownership. I think it was like 83. Now he's climbed all the way up to 90% owned in the game, which is an absolutely ludicrous ownership in the game. I don't think anyone's actually ever been that high. And so the effective ownership, and that includes captaincy, is probably likely going to be around about 150% plus. But given that Haaland is now up to about 90% owned, you're probably looking at an EO closer to about 170%. I suspect that a lot of Salah captainers do have them in their squads in order to captain him against Bournemouth at home this week, while City have a somewhat tricky fixture against Newcastle. So my plan wasn't to go against this 170% EO. I went against Haaland at the start of last season by not even owning him, and I learnt that lesson pretty hard. And then even when I did bring him in, there were some weeks where I went and didn't captain him, and in those weeks, even without the captaincy, even though he was still pulling in all those points, he was so heavily owned that if my alternative captain didn't come through, the rank loss was just massive, like insanely high. So in order to choose an alternative captain, not only do you have to ensure, well, not ensure, because obviously nothing is sure in football, but you're basically saying that this player is going to outscore Haaland. And I would actually wager that they need to outscore Haaland by quite a bit in order to make the alternative captaincy a viable choice. So these are all the reasons why I actually had no plan to captain my second premium. So the reasons behind why I actually wanted a second premium in the team was I wanted Kane, because last season he was the second top scorer in the game, 263 points. Obviously when he was sold to Bayern, Salah was next on the list. He was third top goal scorer in the game, scoring 239 points last year. So the difference between 239 and 63 is roughly about 1 point per fixture between Kane and Salah. This is why I was quite happy to switch from Kane to Salah, because the amount of points that they were both going to score was probably in and around a similar sort of output. There was only a couple of other players that managed to do 200 plus. I think it was Odegaard and might have been Rashford at like 202 and 210 or so. So the difference between Kane at 263 and the 4th and 5th place top scorers last year was about 50 odd points. So actually quite a significant difference. So my plan for having the second premium was to only do that if I was going to be able to offset that player with a low budget option that was going to be able to score relatively consistently. And when I saw the prices come out at the beginning of the season, I noticed that the prices are all pretty kind this year. Not nearly as kind as they were last season, which I think is a good thing, because last season all the teams just ended up looking identical. But the pricing is still pretty kind compared to seasons past, not counting the season that we just went through. So my whole strategy around having the second premium was in a bit of a sorry, I just got interrupted, was a combination type view on how this all ran out. So in both strategies, in my intended strategy and the solo Haaland strategy, both strategies have Haaland and we're just going to perma-captain him. So we actually don't need to worry about Haaland at all. We don't need to include him in any sorts of calculations as to which strategy is going to be more viable. So my two-player combination worked out to be, it was going to be Kane and João Pedro, which ended up switching to Salah in Pedro. So a premium plus Pedro strategy is the strategy that I was running with. Now, the total investment for a premium plus Pedro being 5.5 million and both Kane and Salah starting at 12.5 million, is 18 million invested. And I was looking at that and saying, well, I think a premium plus Pedro for an 18 million investment is going to be able to outscore any other two-player combination of players that I do not own that equals 18 million. And so these are the more expensive, mostly the more expensive midfielders. So I was initially looking at Rashford and Son, both at 9 million. They would have added up to 18 million. Slightly less would have been something like an Odegaard and a Fernandes, both at 8.5 million, would have been a total investment of 17 million. You would have had an extra million spare, which potentially you invested into the bench or maybe one of the other players in your squad. Or on the outside chance, someone like a De Bruyne at 10.5 million plus a 7.5 million option. But I wasn't actually too worried about that at all, because De Bruyne's ownership was so low that I didn't really think about that combination of players too much. So basically what I think is going to play out for my squad is that the combination of Salah and Pedro is going to outscore mostly, I would say, the two highest owned players that are quite expensive would probably be an Odegaard and a Fernandes. Those would be the two players that I am most worried about in terms of this gamble that I'm taking. Now, obviously, the strategy does come with a little bit of risks, and there is a little bit more to consider than just the Salah and Pedro versus Odegaard and Fernandes, because Odegaard and Fernandes doesn't add up to the 18 million that I have in fact invested. And so some other managers are using those funds to, for example, upgrade their bench spot. So bench spot number 1, and what you might see or would have seen out on Twitter and potentially other content creators out there is that their first bench spot is actually very strong. Someone like a Chilwell is sitting in bench spot number 1 for a lot of different teams out there. And so for that calculation, I was thinking, yeah, it would be nice to have a stronger bench spot number 1 compared to my Baldock, who was bench spot number 1 for me in game week 1. But the way that I was looking at it was, the reason that I started with such a light bench is that I'd hardly ever get players in off the bench, especially at the beginning of the game. There's only one game a week. There's no midweek games to worry about. Players don't really have any injuries running into the start of the season. Most of the squads are quite fresh, and so the chance of players actually coming off the bench was relatively low. And so in my head, the way that I was kind of calculating it was, if the managers who invested more in their bench gets a player off the bench for 7 points, and my player comes off the bench, which would be like a Baldock, and only scores 2 points, then that would be a 5-point difference in terms of your auto subs coming in for any given game week. And that I expected that would probably only happen maybe once in every 5 or so game weeks, give or take. 5's an easy number there because it obviously rounds out to 5 points scored across 5 game weeks. Actually averages out to about 1 extra point per week if that bench member that comes off the bench happened to score 7 points. Now, getting a player off the bench that scores 7 points is, well, maybe a lot more likely for a more expensive player. So a lot of managers out there has probably got Chilwell sitting bench spot number 1 and would have been blocked by Gabriel's 4-minute appearance at the end of the game for Arsenal, which obviously very frustrating for all those people out there that had that. But Chilwell coming off the bench there would have automatically gained all those managers who did invest in the bench that extra 7 points over someone like my Baldock, who would have come in for 2 points had Gabriel completely missed out. So the 1 point per week that a manager that has a player coming off the bench that scores 7 points has to be compared to the extra 1 million that I have spent on one of my players in the team. Now, of course, that gets very tricky to kind of nail down as to where exactly I have spent that extra 1 million. You can't really just pick a player at random and figure out whether or not that strategy is working on the whole. But that was kind of what was running in the back of my mind, and I thought, first of all, getting a player off the bench is pretty rare, and when they do come off the bench, they don't typically score too well, because the player that you've put on the bench usually has a pretty tough fixture, and that's why they're obviously on the bench to start with, right? So coming off the bench, most of the time you pick up 2, 3, you'd get quite lucky with a 5 to 7 pointer, and anything more than that is just maximum jam coming off the bench. And so that's kind of why I was quite happy to outlay the 18 million in the Pedro Plus Premium in order to run with 2 premiums in my squad. So the strategy obviously comes with some pretty big risks, and the risk is solely around João Pedro, or whoever that cheap in my case, £5.5 million player that I chose to run with. So there's nowhere to easily run from Pedro. If Pedro, for instance, gets dropped or gets injured, or I don't know, Brighton have some sort of blank that pops up out of the blue. Although blank is probably a little bit less to worry about because that's just for 1 week. It's more the injuries, or if he was dropped, that would really be the problem. So I had to have some plans in place as to exactly what I was going to do if João Pedro A, didn't perform, B, didn't get the minutes, or C, actually ended up getting injured. So the strategy was, I had a few different options. One was to use 2 transfers to move João Pedro to a 5.5 million defender and play a 4-5-1 strategy. Now this is not an ideal way to exit out of the 2 premium setup, because a 5.5 million defender should score okay, but I don't think they will score as well as someone like a João Pedro, who is a really good attacker playing for a really good attacking team who happens to be on penalties. So I do not think I would have run with 2 premiums and a 5.5 million defender instead. But if it was just for a few weeks while João Pedro was maybe nursing some sort of injury that was not going to take him out for ages, then I was kind of happy to do that. The other option was to downgrade a non-premium midfielder in order to upgrade Pedro to about a 7 to a 7.5 million pound asset. There's obviously some choices in at 6 and 6.5 million, but I did not think that those players would be able to keep pace with the amount of output that I was going to require in order for that player plus Salah to keep up within Odegaard and Fernandes across a run of game weeks. Or the other option was, in fact, to downgrade my premium Salah and upgrade João Pedro. Now, downgrading Salah, I could have gone to anyone. Probably I'd be looking at someone like a De Bruyne, assuming that he isn't injured and was still playing. But downgrading a Salah to a De Bruyne would have allowed me to easily upgrade a Pedro for an exit strategy for this 2 premium setup. Now, the other major risk, obviously, with this strategy is all the money is on the pitch in my starting 11, and there is no money on the bench. I've got a 4 million goalkeeper, 2 4 million defenders, and a 4.5 million non-playing striker. So I have to play my starting 11 in every single fixture, irrelevant of how difficult the fixture schedule gets. And so there is a bit of a risk there. But again, the reasons that I was actually quite happy to run with this is João Pedro's on pens and plays for a good attacking team. And so he could theoretically easily get some return in any fixture if they happen to pick up some sort of penalty. And so that's my thoughts around why I was actually running with a 2 premium setup and why I actually have no plans to captain Salah this week against Bournemouth at home. If Salah comes away with a hat-trick, I am going to be extremely happy, of course, because those are just points that are locked into my team. And if Haaland only comes away with 1 goal, then so be it. I have potentially missed out on a lot of Salah points there. But then again, if Haaland scores a goal or 2 and Salah only scores 1 goal or 2 goals, I come out either significantly worse off in terms of rank or about even. And so those risks at that effective ownership level is not actually worth it, given how good Haaland is, how many chances he usually ends up with, and how good those chances are in terms of big chances and his ability to sink them. And so that's it for this video. If you are still watching at this point and you'd like to help the channel out, please do hit that big red subscribe button and the bell icon to be notified about more content coming your way, and give the video a like to help the channel and the algorithm.